On June 17, 1988, 11-year-old Christopher Stevenson went to a Brampton shopping mall with his mother and younger sister. It was the last time his family saw him alive. He was kidnapped from the mall by 45-year-old Joseph Fredericks, a pedophile and psychopath who had spent most of his life in prison and mental institutions. Fredericks held a knife to Christopher's throat and walked him to a vacant lot. There, Christopher was raped, then taken to a basement apartment where he was drugged, raped again, then stabbed to death in a nearby field. Christopher's body was found on Sunday, Father's Day. Fredericks was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 25 years in prison. 4 years later, Fredericks was murdered by another inmate. 2 months before he was killed, Christopher wrote this poem. He called it The Fire. Warm and cozy, glow of light. Warmth and heat throughout the night. Family talk, crackling, pop. Staring at the mantelpiece with the shiny white geese. But as the fire goes out, I have no doubt of the warmth and love throughout our house. Jim Stevenson, Christopher's father, joins us now, and we won't be taking any calls in this segment. I want to thank you for joining us, because I know how painful it is whenever one of these stories comes up in the news again about another pedophile, and another pedophile that's been let out of jail, and when we don't know what kind of other crime might be committed. In some ways, though, at least there's been some improvement in community awareness, that the community does go into action, because we know that there's a real danger posed.
I agree, Jane. My wife and I are extremely concerned with the situation in Toronto, that we are approaching, or we could find ourselves in a situation which is very similar to what we experienced in the summer of 1990 or 1988. But what you say is very true. The public is much more aware of the problems that are presented when an offender like this is reintroduced into a community. Mm-hmm. And it's not surprising, from our perspective, the reaction that we've seen here in the Toronto area over Bobby Oatway.
Yeah. When I look, though, at the recommendations that were made by the inquiry, this is a lot of material, 71 recommendations in total. Of the 71, how many have been enacted?
Well, one of the recommendations of the inquest, in fact, it was the final recommendation, called for an anniversary review, mm-hmm. a report card, on the anniversary date of the verdict. And at that time, there was a report card done on the success of the recommendations and the implementation of the recommendations. And at that point, we found that most of the parties that were involved, or that were investigated and reviewed during the course of the inquest, had gone about making changes that were recommended in the jury verdict. Mm-hmm. The biggest shortcoming, the biggest shortfall and failure to react came from the province of Ontario and from the federal government. And that there's really been not much change since that first anniversary report with respect to the proposals that were directed at Corrections Canada, the Parole Board, and the justice system.
Mm-hmm. Well, Tim has been fighting hard on your behalf to try and get this law brought into place, which could have protected your son had it been in place.
Certainly could have. In fact, we believe that the law that the predator law is needed more than any other tampering that could possibly be done with existing legislation. We don't think it's a major problem for dedicated and directed politicians to direct themselves to. And in fact, I don't really think that it is the failure of politicians so much as it is the insistence of bureaucrats, or the reluctance of bureaucrats to proceed with this in this type of direction.
So then we look at what's going on in Corrections Canada, and it seems so incomprehensible as to why they would behave in the way they do and why they would release people. Do you think it's a lack of education on their part? They don't understand who and what they're dealing with?
No, I think that may be some of the problem. But I really think the problem is focused on the fact that the law requires an individual to be released after they have completed a sentence. Mm-hmm. And there has been no relaxation, there has been no adjustment to that present legislation. And as an individual comes closer and closer to that warrant expiry date, the end of sentence date, Corrections Canada and those people that are dealing with these offenders have no other choice. And in some cases, I think it is choice. If they had their choice, they would. They would move to keep these people incarcerated or in institutions. But they have no choice. The only choice that we feel that they are really avoiding is the choice to force a change in the existing legislation.
So we need to give them the tools.
An unwillingness to listen to this type of proposal.
Right. But when you look at, there have been concerns expressed that there's pressure that's brought to bear on even those who are holding the parole hearings, that they kind of get worn down from having that person, and especially if they're clever and charming and cunning and have all those kinds of things that typically go with this kind of character, that eventually they say, oh, well, let him go and we'll just cross our fingers and hope for the best.
Sure. It's remarkable how more rehabilitated an individual becomes as the warrant expiry date approaches, without any actual ongoing treatment being ever undertaken or administered.
Yeah. So when you are dealing with your own pain over Christopher's death and an issue like this comes up again, is it hard for you to get back into the battle, or is this now part of your life?
I think it's hard. It will always be hard to remember the summer of 1988 and the events that followed. I mean, we went through a trial, and we went through an inquest that was probably more upsetting than the murder trial. But we believe that something has to happen. Something good has to come out of, or constructive has to come out of that terrible weekend in 1988. And we believe that the implementation of sexual predator legislation, a scheme for detaining those who really pose a serious and dangerous threat to the safety of communities, is worth the effort.
So then what do you want from people who are watching and listening?
Well, I believe that we are our democracy, and I believe that as part of the democracy, that change in existing legislation will only come at the insistence of those people who argue long enough and loud enough for change. And I think what I would like to have happen is Canadians across the country contact the Minister of Justice, contact the Federal Solicitor General, and insist that something be done to protect them, their children, and their communities from what we experienced.
Thank you for joining us.
Jane, my pleasure.
Jim Stevenson, you're with Jane Hawtin Live. I'll be right back with the results of our 900 phone poll.